Boone Calloway sent for a housekeeper the same way he handled everything else that needed doing on his ranch. He made a list, he wrote a letter, and he expected results. The list read, woman, capable, not prone to conversation, able to cook and manage a household without supervision, willing to relocate to the Texas Panhandle, no objection to hard work. He sent it to a placement agency in Kansas City in the spring of 1889, along with a photograph taken at the county assessor's office in which he looked, as his foreman later described, like a man who had been informed of a death in the family and was not particularly surprised by it. What arrived on the Santa Fe line 7 weeks later was a 34-year-old widow from Cincinnati named Maren Quill, who stood 5 feet 9 in her traveling boots, had a set of opinions about everything from soil composition to the theology of John Calvin, and had decided somewhere around Amarillo that whatever situation she was walking into it as herself and not as a set of specifications on a piece of paper. I have thought about that train ride for a long time. What it must have felt like to watch the land flatten out into nothing but grass and sky and distance, knowing that somewhere in all that open country was a man you had never met, who had described what he wanted from a woman, the way you might describe what you wanted from a plow. I have thought about what it takes to keep your back straight in a situation like that, and I have thought about how the most important things in a person's life so rarely arrive looking the way they were supposed to. This is the story of how Boone Calloway asked for a housekeeper and got something entirely different. And how that difference turned out to be the only thing that saved him. Boone Calloway had come to the Texas Panhandle in 1878 with 2 horses, a land certificate, and the kind of stubbornness that looks like confidence from a distance. He was 31 years old. He had grown up in eastern Tennessee, the second son of a man who believed that silence was strength and that asking for help was a weakness you could not afford. Boone had taken this to heart in the way that second sons sometimes do, completely and at cost. By 1889 he had built something real, 420 acres along the Canadian River, a main house with plank floors and 2 fireplaces, a bunkhouse that held 6 hens during calving season, 800 head of cattle that wintered better than anyone else's in Hemphill County, because Boone had read everything he could find about feeding and shelter and applied it without sentiment. He was 42 years old, lean, sun-weathered, and entirely alone. His wife, Catherine, had died in 1885 of a fever that moved through the county that summer like a slow fire. They had been married 4 years. They had not been unhappy, exactly, but they had not been easy together either. Catherine had come from a family in Nashville that spoke in full sentences and hosted dinner parties, and Boone had never quite learned how to be in a room with her without feeling that he was doing it wrong. When she died, he grieved. And beneath the grief, in a place he would not look at directly, there was also something that felt like relief. The relief that he did not have to keep trying at something he did not know how to do. After Catherine, Boone did not try again. He managed the house himself for 2 years, badly. Then hired a succession of women who stayed between 3 months and 1 year, and left for reasons ranging from the loneliness to the fact that Boone communicated primarily through looks and single-syllable answers, and the average person found this, over time, to be intolerable. The last one, a Mrs. Aldine Pratt, had told him directly before she departed for Tascosa, "Mr. Calloway, you are not a difficult man to work for. You are a difficult man to exist in the same room with. I wish you well." Boone had thought about that for several months. Then he had written the letter to Kansas City. Maren Quill stepped off the Santa Fe at Canadian Depot on April 3, 1889. Wearing a gray wool coat that was too heavy for the weather and carrying a trunk, a carpet bag, and a cast-iron skillet wrapped in burlap that she had refused to pack inside the trunk because, as she later explained, she did not trust anyone else to handle it properly. Boone was waiting at the platform. He had his hat in his hands because his mother had taught him that much at least. Maren looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The agency told me you have 400 acres. That photograph made it look like you have 400 problems." Boone said, "The photograph was taken at the assessor's office." Maren said, "I know what assessor's offices do to a man's face. I am merely noting that you look like you've been carrying something heavy for a while, and haven't decided yet whether to put it down." Boone had no answer for that. He picked up her trunk. On the ride to the ranch, Maren asked about the water situation, the state of the kitchen, the number of hands he employed, whether there was a physician within reasonable distance, and what had happened to the previous housekeeper. Boone answered the first 4. On the 5th he said, "She found the situation unsuitable." Maren said, "The situation or you?" Boone said, "Both probably." Maren looked out at the canyon country, opening up to the south, the red rock walls and the cedar breaks and the river cutting through all of it like a scar that had healed clean, and she said, "Well, that's an honest answer at least." It was the most honest thing Boone Calloway had said about himself in 4 years. He did not know why he had said it. He did not say anything else for the rest of the ride. She did not make herself small. Boone had expected, without quite realizing he had expected it, a woman who would move through the house quietly and not require anything from him beyond a wage and a roof. What he got was Maren Quill, who within 48 hours had reorganized his kitchen, identified 3 places where the roof needed resealing before the summer rains, and informed him that his bookkeeping system was, in her opinion, a disaster that would eventually cost him money. Boone said, "You were hired to manage the household." Maren said, "The household includes the finances that pay for it. Do you want me to look at the ledger or not?" He let her look at the ledger. She found 2 errors that had been compounding quietly for 2 years. He corrected them without comment. She had been a widow for 3 years. Her husband, a man named Daniel, had run a dry goods supply business in Cincinnati. He had been a decent man, she said once, matter-of-factly, and then she did not say anything further about him, and Boone did not ask, because he understood the kind of grief that does not want to be excavated by someone who wasn't there. She had 1 child, a daughter named Rose, aged 7, who had stayed in Cincinnati with Maren's sister while Maren went ahead to see if the situation was livable. This detail, that she had a child, that she had left her, was the one thing in Maren's composure that showed a crack. Not when she said it, but after, when she thought he wasn't looking, there was something in her face that was not hardness. It was the look of a woman who had made a necessary choice and was not certain she had made the right one. Boone saw it. He did not say anything, but he saw it. The first real thing that happened between them, the thing that changed the temperature of the house, was not what either of them would have predicted. It was a Thursday in late May. Boone had been out since before dawn, trying to locate 3 head of cattle that had pushed through a fence line into the canyon country south of the river. He came home at dusk empty-handed, with a cut on his forearm from the wire and a mood that could have stopped a clock. He came into the kitchen expecting nothing. Maren had the lamp lit and something on the stove that smelled like it came from a different, warmer world than the one he had just spent 12 hours in. She took one look at his arm, said nothing, and pointed at the chair by the table. He sat. She cleaned the cut without asking permission and without flinching, with the efficiency of a woman who had dealt with worse. She wrapped it with strips torn from a cloth she produced from somewhere without explanation. She said, while she was working, 3 cattle. He said, "Yes," she said. "Did you find the break in the fence?" He said, "Half-mile south of the 3rd post. Cattle got spooked by something. Probably a cat." She said, "The Garcia family 2 miles east lost a calf last week to a mountain lion. One of their hands told me when I was in town." Boone looked at her. "When were you in town?" "Tuesday. I needed vinegar and lamp oil. Your foreman, Cress, took me in on the wagon." A pause. "You didn't know that. You should know what's happening on your own property, Mr. Calloway." She said it without reproach. Just flatly, as a fact. The way a good advisor states a problem. Boone said, "I know." And he meant it in the same way she had said it. Not as a criticism accepted but as an honest admission. He knew. He had been managing the cattle and the land and the business and had not been managing the rest of it. The house, the people in it. The information that mattered. Maren set a bowl in front of him. It was a beef and potato stew that she had made from the last of the root vegetables in the cellar, and some dried herbs she had brought from Cincinnati in a tin box she kept on the kitchen shelf. He ate it without speaking. It was the best meal he had eaten since Catherine died. He did not say so. But something in him shifted quietly, like a door coming slightly off a latch it had been pressed against for years. By June, Maren had written to her sister in Cincinnati to say that the situation was livable. She did not write that it was more than livable. She was not yet ready to write that, but it was more than livable. She had found, in the bookshelves in Boone's main room, a collection of books that surprised her. Not what she had expected from a cattle rancher in the Panhandle. There was Emerson, dog-eared in a way that suggested actual reading rather than display. There was a geological survey of the Canadian River Basin that someone had annotated in a small cramped hand she recognized as Boone's. There was a Spanish dictionary with a broken spine. There was a single volume of poetry, Longfellow, that was newer than the rest and had the particular untouched quality of a gift that had been kept but not opened. She asked him once casually about the Emerson. He said, "I bought it at a trading post in New Mexico in '81. Man told me it would improve my thinking. I've read it 4 times, I'm not sure it's worked." Maren laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in that house. Boone looked up from what he was doing. He looked the way a man looks when he's heard a sound he has been missing for a long time without knowing he'd been missing it. He looked back down and said nothing. But there was something different in the set of his shoulders, she noticed. She was that kind of woman, the kind who notices. The crisis came in July and it did not announce itself. Boone received a letter from his brother in Tennessee. His father was dying. The letter was brief and did not use the word dying, because the men in their family did not use that kind of language, but Boone read what was underneath the words. His father wanted him to come back. Boone had not been back in 11 years. He had his reasons, and they were the kind of reasons that don't get smaller with time, only more fixed. He said nothing to Maren about the letter for 3 days. He carried it in his coat pocket and went about his work with even less conversation than usual, which Maren had not believed was possible but which turned out to be. On the 3rd day she said, "Something's wrong. You don't have to tell me what it is. but you should know that it's visible. Boone said. What is? She said. That you're carrying something you can't put down and it's getting heavier. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long moment. Then he took the letter out of his coat pocket and put it on the table. Maren read it. She folded it carefully and gave it back. She said, How long since you've seen him? He said. 11 years. She said. Is there a reason? He said. Several. She said. Are any of them ones that will still matter after he's gone? The question landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Boone did not answer it, but he also did not leave. He said finally, he was not an easy man. Maren said. Most of the ones worth going back to aren't. He looked at her. She was standing at the stove with her back half to him, and she said it the way she said most things. Not as comfort, not as advice, but as a plain fact that she had arrived at from her own experience and was offering for whatever use it might be. Boone said. Your father? Maren said. My husband. A pause. I thought I had more time to figure out what we were to each other. I didn't. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the cedar brakes the way it always did in the evening, that low steady sound that you stopped hearing after a while, and then one day heard again and didn't know why. Boone left for Tennessee 6 days later. He was gone 3 weeks. When he came back he looked different. Not better or worse exactly. Older, maybe. Or more complete. The way something looks after it's been through a process it couldn't skip. He came into the kitchen at dusk with his saddlebags over his shoulder, and Maren looked up from the table where she was writing a letter to Rose and she said, How was it? He said. He died on the second day I was there. We had one conversation before he went. She said, Was it thought about that? Then he said, It was what there was. Maren nodded. She understood that. The acceptance of what there was, rather than grief for what there should have been. She had learned that lesson herself, the hard way, the way most people learn the lessons that stick. She got up and put coffee on, and Boone sat down at the kitchen table, and they were quiet together, and the quiet was not empty. Rose arrived in September. Maren had arranged it carefully, had written to her sister, had prepared the small room off the kitchen that she had been using for her own things. She had told Boone 2 weeks before in the morning directly, I would like to send for my daughter. I understand this changes the terms of my employment. I would like to discuss it. Boone had looked at her. He said, You don't need to discuss it. Maren said, I want to. She is 7 years old. She will be in the house. She will need a place at the table and she will talk more than you are accustomed to. Boone said, Most things talk more than I'm accustomed to. Maren said, I am serious, Mr. Calloway. He said, So am I. Send for her. Rose Quill arrived on the Santa Fe on a Tuesday in September and was the smallest, most observant child Boone had encountered since he could remember, possibly ever. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's tendency to look at people like she was cataloging them. She looked at Boone for a long moment when they met at the depot and then said, You're taller than I expected. Boone said, I get that. Rose said, Mama says you don't talk much. Boone said, Your mama is right. Rose considered this. Then she said, That's okay. My father didn't talk much either. He just showed you things. Boone was quiet for a moment, then he said, What kind of things? Rose said, How to balance the accounts, how to tell if a storm was coming by the way the birds moved, how to find south without a compass. Boone said, South is easy, you want to learn it? Rose said, Yes. That was, as near as I can tell, the moment Boone Calloway started to come back from wherever he had gone when Catherine died. Not all the way back. You never come all the way back from something like that. But back toward something. Back toward the daily practice of being a person who exists in relation to other people, rather than simply alongside them. The autumn was dry and the work was hard, and the three of them moved through the days of it in a way that did not have a name yet but was becoming something. Rose learned south and then learned east, and then declared she was going to learn to ride before the end of October, which she did, on a small paint mare named Lucy that one of the hands had gentled down for use as a remuda horse. She fell off twice and got up both times without fuss, which was so much like Maren that Boone had to look away to keep his expression neutral. He built a small writing desk for Rose's room from pine boards left over from a fence repair. He planed it smooth and fitted a small shelf above it for her books, which she had brought from Cincinnati in a satchel she carried herself the whole way on the train. When he brought it in and set it down, Rose looked at it and looked at him and said, formally, Thank you, Mr. Calloway. This is exactly the right size. Boone said, You're welcome. He did not know why his voice had gone rough on those 2 words. He left before Rose could ask about it. He stood outside in the cooling air for a while. The stars were coming up over the canyon rim to the east. He had lived in this country for 11 years and he still thought about those stars. Not about them exactly, just noticed them. The way they just kept being there, reliable and indifferent, asking nothing. He went back inside. What happened in November was quiet, the way the most important things usually are. Maren had been fighting a cough for 2 weeks that she refused to acknowledge the seriousness of and refused to do anything about, because she was, in Boone's observation, constitutionally unable to be the one who needed tending. He watched her get thinner and colder and more careful in her movements for 12 days and said nothing. Because he had been raised not to say anything, and because he did not know how to say it. On the 13th night he came downstairs and found her at the kitchen table at night, not working, just sitting, wrapped in a blanket, with a cup of something that had gone cold at her elbow. She looked up and said, "I'm fine," he says. "You're not," she said. "I will be," he said. "That's not the same thing." He built the fire up in the kitchen stove without asking whether she wanted it. He heated water and made a tea from dried herbs that his foreman Cress had shown him once, that Cress had learned from his grandmother, some mixture of things that grew wild along the creek bottoms and that nobody wrote down, but that worked. He brought it to her and set it on the table. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." He pulled a chair to the other side of the table, and sat down and opened the newspaper that had come from Amarillo 3 days ago, and he read it, or appeared to read it. He sat with her while she drank the tea, and then while she stopped coughing so much, and then while her shoulders finally came down from where they had been living up near her ears for 2 weeks. At some point she said quietly, "I'm not used to being the one who needs something." He said without looking up from the paper, "Most people aren't. Doesn't change the needing." Maren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Were you always this way?" He said, "What way?" She said, "Perceptive, just very quiet about it." Boone put the paper down. He thought about that honestly, the way he tried to think about things. He said, "I think I was always perceptive. The quiet part I learned because it was easier. Easier than saying the wrong thing. Easier than saying the right thing and having someone look at you like you don't mean it." Maren said, "And do you mean it?" He said, "When I say something I mean it. I just don't say much." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. She had been a practical woman all her life. She had married practically and grieved practically, and moved herself to the Texas Panhandle practically. And she had kept everything she felt in the part of herself that she managed and monitored and did not let run loose. And sitting there at midnight in a ranch kitchen in the canyon country with a man who had sat up to make her tea without being asked, she felt something shift in that management. Not break. Shift, she said. "That's the right answer," he said. "I know." And the room was warm, and outside the north wind was moving down through the canyon from somewhere colder, and inside the stove was ticking with heat, and neither of them moved. The real turning, the one that made everything else make sense, happened at Christmas. Not because Christmas is where these things happen, but because it happened to be December. And because the thing that happened was the kind of thing that could only have happened after months of smaller things had made room for it. Boone had not made anything of Christmas in 4 years. The holiday sat on the calendar like a word in a language he had forgotten. He had no decorations and no inclination toward them, and no memory of the season that didn't reach back to his mother's house in Tennessee, which was a long way away in every sense. He came downstairs on Christmas morning and stopped in the doorway of the main room. Maren and Rose had been up since before light. They had cut juniper boughs from the breaks along the river and arranged them on the mantel and windowsills, and the whole room smelled like the outdoors come inside. Rose had made paper stars from the brown paper that goods came wrapped in at the general store, and they hung from the ceiling beams on thread. On the table was a platter of sand tarts, a German recipe. Maren told him later that she had gotten from a neighbor woman in Cincinnati and had been making every Christmas since Rose was 2. She had been hiding the ingredients in her trunk for 3 weeks. Boone stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked at the juniper and the paper stars, and the cookies and the woman, and the child standing by the table looking back at him, and something happened in his chest that he did not have a word for. Something that had been packed down and sealed off for 4 years, since Catherine, since the silence and the relief and the grief he hadn't been able to look at directly. He said, "You did all this." Maren said, "It's Christmas even in the Panhandle." He said, "My mother used to put cedar on the mantel. Back in Tennessee." He stopped. His voice had done the rough thing again. He said, "We called it making the house ready." Maren's eyes filled. She did not blink. She said, "In German there is a word, Heimelig. It means the feeling of being sheltered, of being somewhere that holds you." Rose said from beside her mother, "Is that what this is?" Boone looked at the child. He said. Rose nodded, satisfied, the way children are satisfied by things being named. She went to the table and picked up a sand tart and handed it to him with the solemnity of someone performing an official function. He took it. He looked at Maren. He said, "I don't have a word for what I'm trying to say." She said, "You don't have to have a word for it." He said, "I want to." She said, "I know." They stood on opposite sides of the table in that juniper-scented room on Christmas morning and did not move toward each other and did not need to. The door had been opened. They were both adults who had been hurt by life and made sensible by it, and they understood that a door being opened was enough, for now, and that what came next would come at its own pace, and not be rushed into something it wasn't ready to be. Boone Calloway and Maren Quill were married the following April by the circuit preacher who came through Hemphill County twice a year, and who performed the ceremony in the main room of the ranch house before an audience of 6. The foreman Cress and his wife, two of the hands, and Rose, who stood beside her mother in a blue dress she had helped sew herself, and who afterward informed everyone that she had known it would end this way since September. Boone looked at her and said, "Did you?" Rose said, "You built me a desk." Cress's wife, who had heard this exchange, said later that she had never seen Boone Calloway smile, actually smile with his eyes and everything before that moment. It turned out he was capable of it. He had just been waiting for the right reason. They ranched along the Canadian River for 36 years. Maren kept the books in the house and her cast-iron skillet, and she taught Rose to read accounts and to ride and eventually to run a household of her own. Boone taught Rose to find south and to read weather and to say what she meant and mean what she said. Rose became a school teacher in Amarillo, the best kind, the kind that children remember their whole lives. The ranch grew to 600 acres. The juniper came inside every Christmas until Maren died in 1931 at the age of 76, and then Boone brought it in himself every year until he died 3 years later at 87, which is the kind of thing a man does when he has finally understood what a house being ready means. He is buried next to Maren on the canyon rim above the river, where the cedar breaks run south toward the Red Rock country, and the sky is so big it takes a minute to adjust to it every time. He sent for a housekeeper. She arrived with a cast-iron skillet and no intention of being managed. And what they built from that beginning was not what either of them had planned, because the best things rarely are. The best things are what you find when you stop insisting on what you ordered and start paying attention to what actually showed up. I've been thinking about this story for a long time. About how long Boone carried his silence like it was a virtue, and how long it took him to understand that the people who loved him weren't asking him to be different. They were just asking him to be present. About how Maren crossed half the country with a skillet and a 7-year-old's future in her hands and didn't let the size of the risk stop her from walking into it with her eyes open. About how a desk, built from leftover pine boards, can be an act of love without a single word attached to it. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. What was the moment you knew Boone was no longer just a man with a housekeeper, but a man who had found something he didn't know he'd been missing? Was it the tea at midnight? The desk? The Christmas morning when he said he wanted to find the word? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want another story about two people who found each other through the particular stubbornness of showing up and refusing to disappear, it's right here waiting for you.